Section 14 of The Sexes in Science and History by Eliza Burt Gamble. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Early Historic Society, Chapter 3, Ancient Sparta. Although in the writings commonly ascribed to Homer is to be observed a fairly correct picture of many phases of Greek life, the earliest authentic historical accounts which we have of this people are perhaps those of Aristotle and Plutarch. In the accounts given of the Lacedaemonians by the last named of these writers, the fact is shown that male influence among the Spartans of the time of Lycurgus had not reached that state of intense and overshadowing domination in which we find the Athenians of the Solonic period submerged. The early Dorians were ever ready to uphold the ancient customs as opposed to innovations. In the management of public affairs, they trusted to the ties of relationship rather than to political organization based on property. The policy of the Athenians, on the contrary, as enunciated by Pericles, was that it was not the country and the people, but movable and personal property in the proper sense of the word, which makes states great and powerful. The one policy was essentially Doric, the other Ionic. The exact time at which Lycurgus occupied the position of lawgiver to the Spartans is not known, but it is claimed by Xenophon that he lived shortly after the age of Homer. If the accounts of the Lacedaemonians, which have come down to us in connection with the name of this legislator, belong to that early age, if scarcely one ethnical period had elapsed since woman's influence was supreme in the home and in the group, we would naturally expect to find in their customs, usages, and regulations for the management of society certain traces of a former state of female independence, and a hint, at least, of those principles of liberty and equality in the establishment of the commonwealth which were the result of female influence. Especially would this be true, as we are informed that the Spartans were conservative people, clinging to the prejudices of more ancient times. A glance at Spartan institutions at the time indicated furnishes ample proof of the fact that the Lacedaemonians were still to a considerable extent living under conditions which had been established under the archaic rule of the gens. The Spartan Senate, as reconstructed by Lycurgus, was composed of 30 members, including the 2 kings or military leaders. These chiefs were the heads of the several gentes. The ecclesia, or assembly of the people, contained originally all the free males who dwelt within the city and were of legal age. Hence may be observed the fact that the constitution of the state was the same as that in the upper status of barbarism. Yet the spectacle of a double monarchy, notwithstanding the fact that it has been designated as a kind of irresponsible generalship, shows that the power attached to the office of basileus had become a menace to the liberties of the people. Hence this equal division of responsibility and authority. The Spartan men were warriors who had subjugated the country, making serfs of the original inhabitants. In the time of Lycurgus, these gentlemen soldiers constituted an aristocratic class who spent their lives in the performance of public duties, leaving the cultivation of the soil to the serfs. Helots, the name given to the serfs, signifies captives. They were the slave population of Laconia. The manufacturers and tradespeople of the towns and country districts around Sparta were free, but had been deprived of their political rights. It is evident from these facts that although the constitution of the state had not been changed, the division of the people into classes, a division which since the latter part of the second status of barbarism had been threatened, had through spoliation and conquest already taken place. Add to this the fact that property had passed into the hands of private individuals, and we shall observe that the conditions had already become favorable for the development of that thirst for wealth and power which characterizes monarchical institutions. If we carefully note the early condition of Spartan society and studiously observe the processes involved in the growth of human institutions, we shall be enabled to perceive the nature of the load under which the Spartans groaned in the time of Lycurgus. The fact has been noted that, throughout an entire ethnical period, human ingenuity had been taxed to the utmost to subdue or keep in check the growing tendency toward usurpation and tyranny, and the spectacle of a double monarchy or of two military chieftains, as they appeared in ancient Sparta, indicates an attempt on the part of the people to divide the power which had become attached to this office, and which was doubtless already menacing the popular rights. In addition to the turmoil and strife engendered by the thirst for power were the turbulence and frequent insurrections of the serfs, who, it will be remembered, had previously been free, and who were therefore restless and impatient under the tyranny of their Spartan masters. Although wealth had greatly increased in Sparta during the ages immediately preceding the Lycurgan system, yet that the disorders which prevailed were in no wise attributable to luxury and enervation is shown in the fact, as given by Aristotle, that the men during their frequent campaigns had become inured to the rigors and hardships of a soldier's life. He says, "For during the wars of the Lacedaemons, first against the Argives and afterwards against the Arcadians and Messenians, the men were long away from home, and on the return of peace they gave themselves into the legislator's hands, already prepared by the discipline of a soldier's life, in which there were many elements of virtue, to receive his enactments." It is indeed plain that the state of disorder which prevailed at Sparta in the time of Lycurgus can be accounted for in no other way than that the people were no longer able to keep in check the constantly increasing egoism and selfishness developed within the governing classes, the extent to which all wise regulations are attributed to the governing head is plainly apparent in the view taken of the management of Sparta, which Herodotus and Plutarch ascribe to Lycurgus, but which, in the very nature of the case, must have originated from other sources. It is in no wise probable that Lycurgus instituted any such radical changes in the constitution of the state as have been ascribed to him by the above writers, for, as we have seen prior to his appearance as lawgiver, the government was administered by a military chieftain or basileus, a senate, and an assembly of the people. In order to strengthen their authority, the kings had made common cause with the assembly of the people, and through these means had drawn to themselves nearly all the powers originally vested in that body, while the senate, destitute of support, had gradually yielded up its functions to them. Before accepting the statements of these writers, attributing to Lycurgus that almost unparalleled degree of genius by means of which was originated an entirely new set of institutions, all the accessible facts relative to these institutions should without prejudice be closely scrutinized, especially as they involve principles and actions which could scarcely have been forced upon a people through an arbitrary stretch of power in the hands of a single individual. Doubtless the principal changes in the government inaugurated by Lycurgus were, first, the importance which he caused to be attached to the assembly of the people, and second, the restoration of the Senate. By strengthening this body, which was originally composed of the heads of the gentes, the Gentile organization was in a measure restored to its original dignity. The extreme anxiety felt in the time of Lycurgus lest the people's rights be invaded is shown in the fact that the three administrative functions of the government were supplemented by 5 ephors, chosen annually as agents of the people, whose chief prerogative it was to scrutinize the acts of the chief magistrate and other guardians of the commonwealth. Although the office of the ephors is much older than the Lycurgan legislation, it had previously been abolished or had sunk into disuse. The ephors of Lycurgus were probably appointed for the special purpose of watching over the Lycurgan discipline and punishing those who neglected it. Later, however, when through the greed for gain and the inordinate thirst for power, the ephors in their turn had drawn to themselves the greater share of the powers belonging to the state, the military commander, or so-called king, became responsible to them for his conduct even while directing the army in the field. He received his orders from them, and although in cases of emergency he was authorized to exercise the power of life and death according to Xenophon, they could accuse the king and compel him to defend his acts or suffer the penalty of death. By a gradual process of usurpation, the ephors had, by the time of Thucydides, completely superseded the king as the directors of affairs at Sparta. The fact has been observed that the authority of the Senate, a body which in earlier times had been composed of the heads of the Genates, who were elected by all the people and who held their office only during good behavior, had in the time of Lycurgus, through the growth of the monarchical and aristocratic party, become weakened, and that, As the kings had drawn to themselves the powers formerly belonging to the popular assembly, the people were no longer represented, but had been obliged to surrender their independence to the authority of the military leaders. It is altogether likely, therefore, that the load under which the Spartans are said to have groaned, and from which Lycurgus is supposed to have released them, was the undue assumption of power by the Basileus and the aristocratic party, and that the chief service which he lent to the state was the sanction which he gave to those principles of equality and liberty which had been recognized and practiced at a time when the gens as the unit of human society was still in its original vitality and strength, and when woman's influence was therefore in the ascendancy. Most modern writers agree in the opinion that Lycurgus instituted no fundamental changes in the constitution of the state. Indeed, all the accessible facts relative to this subject go to prove that the attempt at legislative reform in the time of this lawgiver did not begin with him, but, on the contrary, that all along the line of development, for an entire ethnical period, there had been a struggle between the people on the one hand and the constantly increasing power exercised by the rulers on the other. Concerning the measures instituted by Lycurgus and the way in which the political power was distributed by him, we are assured that it was according to a ritra of this legislator given under the direction of the Pythian Apollo. Build a temple to Jupiter Hellenius and Minerva Hellania. Divide the tribes and institute 30 obas. Appoint a council with its princes. Convene the assembly between Babica and Cnastion. Propose this, and then depart, and let there be a right of decision and power to the people. By this decree the assembly was invested with authority to reject or accept any proposed measures of the council and princes. Later, however, when the chiefs and the military leaders would draw to themselves a portion of the power which had been delegated to the people, we find subjoined to the original document of the priestess the following clause: "But if the people should follow a crooked opinion, the elders and the princes shall dissent." Or, according to Plutarch, "If the people attempt to corrupt any law, the Senate and chiefs shall retire," meaning that they shall dissolve the assembly and annul the alterations. According to the testimony of Plutarch, when Lycurgus entered upon the duties of lawgiver, he went to Crete, and while there examined the laws of that people. Those of them which he considered wise and suited to the needs of a commonwealth, and which were based on principles involving the highest interests of the people, he incorporated into his system. Now the Cratons were a branch of the Doric stock, and as among them descent and rights of succession were still traced through women, it would seem that they had preserved much of that simplicity of manner which characterizes primitive society. Upon his return from Crete, Lycurgus made an equal division of the land, and as he could not induce the people to surrender their treasures, he prohibited the use of gold and silver currency and substituted iron in its place. To a great quantity and weight of this metal he assigned a slight value, so that to lay up a small amount of wealth a whole room was required, and for the removal of a moderate sum of money a yoke of oxen must be employed. When this became current, many kinds of injustice ceased in Lacedaemonia. Who would steal or take a bribe? Who would defraud or rob, when he could not conceal the booty, when he could neither be dignified by the possession of it, nor, if cut in pieces, be served by its use? There is little evidence in support of the statement of Plutarch that Lycurgus attempted to establish a community of goods among the Spartans. Although he caused the landed possessions which had been parcelled out to individuals to be returned to the state, too much interest had already become attached to personal possessions to have made a division of this kind of wealth possible. A legislator may not enact laws with the expectation of seeing them enforced, which are not in accord with the temper of the people, and the degree of success which attended the legislation ascribed to Lycurgus proves that the great mass of the people were in sympathy with many of the measures which he proposed for the government of Sparta. It is plain that the object of the person, or persons, whom history has named Lycurgus, was a return to the simpler manners and purer customs of a more primitive age, which the growth of the aristocratic spirit and the accumulation of wealth in masses in the hands of the few threatened entirely to subvert, and, as a community of goods was at this time impossible, he or they sought to level the distinctions between rich and poor by exalting virtue and moral excellence, above the mere possessions of wealth and hereditary titles. It is the opinion of some writers that although Lycurgus did not inaugurate a new set of institutions, nor materially change the constitution of the state, the great service which he rendered to the Spartans was a remarkable system of discipline which he is supposed to have inaugurated. Of this Mr. Rawlinson says, "It must always remain one of the most astonishing facts in history that such a system was successfully imposed upon a state which had grown up without it." Of the fact, however, that the state had not grown up without it there is ample evidence. On this subject Curtius remarks: "It is certain that the Spartan discipline in many respects corresponds to the primitive customs of the Dorians, and that by constant practice, handed down from generation to generation, it grew into the second nature of the members of the community." From the facts at hand it is quite evident that Lycurgus did not originate that system of discipline through which it is claimed Spartan greatness was achieved. The fact has been noted that when he entered upon the duties of lawgiver he sailed for Crete, and having been struck with admiration of some of their laws, he resolved to make use of them in Sparta. As the discipline of Lycurgus constitutes the principal feature of the government ascribed to him, and as his models were for the most part drawn from the Cratons, it is only reasonable to suppose that this remarkable system was itself, in part at least, copied from them. It appears that among the Cratons, as among all peoples among whom female influence is in the ascendancy, the children belonged to the mother, and that women owned, or at least controlled, their own households. They did not, therefore, follow the fathers of their children to their homes. In Crete the young Dorians were left in the houses of their mothers till they grew up into youths. As Cretan mothers had charge of their sons until they were grown up, it is not unlikely that the discipline which Lycurgus attempted to copy was a system inaugurated under matriarchal usages, but which in Sparta, in the time of Lycurgus, may have become somewhat relaxed. However, that the primitive discipline of the Dorian people was not extinct among the Spartans of this time is observed in the warlike character of the males and in the express testimony of Aristotle that Spartan men had become inured to hardships by means of their frequent campaigns. To restore, or rather to intensify this discipline, seems to have been the object of Lycurgus, yet that he lacked greatly in judgment is shown by the measures which he put into execution. We are informed that Spartan boys were, as early as their 8th year, taken into public training and assigned their places in their respective divisions, where they had to go through all the exercises introductory to military service and accustom their bodies to endurance and exercise, in exact obedience to the forms acquired by the state through its officers. This interference with the natural development of the Spartan youth was not without its effect upon his character, and especially so as the policy adopted was such as to narrow his mental horizon and confine his ideas within the scope of Spartan possibilities. From all the evidence to be gathered about the individual, whom historians call Lycurgus, it would appear that he was a fanatic, who, doubtless feeling deeply the disorders which had fastened themselves upon society, attempted to manage not only the affairs of the state, but to impose his authority also upon individual conduct. Of the position occupied by women at the time when Lycurgus is said to have been lawgiver at Sparta, there seems to be much evidence going to show that they were in the possession of a remarkable degree of liberty, and that they were possessed of great power and influence. We have seen that while the men of Sparta were away from their homes engaged in warfare, the country had become wealthy and prosperous. Not only was the land controlled by women, but nearly 2/5 of it was theirs by actual possession. Therefore, when Aristotle informs us that when Lycurgus wanted to bring the women under his laws, they resisted and he gave up the attempt, we are by no means surprised. Indeed, Aristotle himself says that this license of the Lacedaemonian women existed from the earliest times and was only what might be expected. It is altogether likely that in the time of Lycurgus Spartan women had not been brought under subjection to male authority. According to the accounts given by Aristotle and Plutarch and the regulations made by Lycurgus, the men dined on the plainest fare at the public table or mess, while the women remained within their own homes. That a considerable degree of success crowned these legislators' efforts to control the conduct and private life of men, from the facts at hand may not be doubted. Among the women, however, the case seems to have been altogether different. Of the Spartans, Aristotle says, "In the days of their greatness many things were managed by their women. But what difference does it make whether women rule, or the rulers are ruled by women? Because, however, the Spartan women preferred to remain within their own homes and refused to allow their private affairs to be controlled by Lycurgus, Aristotle accuses them of intemperance and luxury. He says, "For a husband and a wife, being each a part of every family, the state may be considered as about equally divided into men and women. And, therefore, in those states in which the condition of the women is bad, half the city may be regarded as having no laws. And this is what has actually happened at Sparta. The legislator wanted to make the whole state temperate, and he has carried out his intentions in the case of the men, but he has neglected the women, who live in every sort of intemperance and luxury." So far, however, from the Spartan women refusing to concur in those movements which were in operation to make the whole state hardy and temperate, we have ample evidence going to prove that it was women themselves who, in former times, had encouraged the healthful and moderate exercise of body and limb among the youth of both sexes. Indeed, from natural inferences to be drawn from the facts at hand, it is probable that these exercises, which had originated among the primitive Dorians while under the matriarchal system, had not only been encouraged but practiced by women while their husbands and fathers were absent on their campaigns. We have seen that, according to Aristotle, women refused to unite in those movements in operation in the time of Lycurgus for the strengthening and general improvement of the youth. Plutarch, on the contrary, ascribes all the physical strength and vigor of mind possessed by Spartan women to the wise regulations of Lycurgus, and, notwithstanding the fact that, according to his own testimony, they were possessed of great liberty and power, he imputes to this legislator the inauguration of all those practices for the promotion of perfect freedom among women which were so salutary in producing or continuing a healthful state of public morals. It is plain that the position occupied by Spartan women presented difficulties to the minds of Aristotle and Plutarch, which they were wholly unable to explain. With regard to the supposition of Plutarch that the exercises performed by the young women of Sparta while in a nude or semi-nude condition were inaugurated by Lycurgus, it is too unreasonable for serious consideration. It is to be doubted if there has ever existed, either in ancient or modern times, a legislator who, unaided and alone, and simply through a stretch of arbitrary power, has been able to regulate the dress, amusements, bodily exercise, and general movements of women in possession of a reasonable degree of personal freedom and liberty of action. Respecting the wise regulations instituted by Lycurgus for the management of women, Plutarch says, "In order to take away the excessive tenderness and delicacy of the sex, the consequence of a recluse life, he accustomed the virgins occasionally to be seen naked, as well as the young men, and to dance and sing in their presence on certain festivals." Perhaps, throughout the entire narrative of Plutarch concerning Lycurgus and his laws, there is nothing so absolutely devoid of reason as this. If, as he assures us, women were possessed of that excessive tenderness and delicacy which are the result of a recluse life, and if, as he supposes, they had hitherto been trained according to masculine ideas of female modesty and decorum, it is greatly to be doubted if the laws of Lycurgus, or even the lightnings of Zeus, could have driven these virgins into the presence of the opposite sex under the conditions named. Doubtless, the Spartan people had not at this stage of their career departed so far from the customs of gynecocracy that women were unable to exercise absolute control over their persons. Being free from the domination of the opposite sex, all those exercises and habits of body in use to increase their own vigor and that of the entire race had doubtless been instigated by women, or, at least, had been instituted at a time when female influence was in the ascendancy. Concerning the position occupied by the women of Sparta, Plutarch says they had assumed to themselves great liberty and power on account of the frequent expeditions of their husbands, during which they were left sole mistresses at home, and so gained an undue deference and improper titles. It is evident that this writer was unacquainted with the fact that at a time not far distant in the past from the age of Lycurgus, the influence of women in the family and in the gens had been supreme. Hence, Like others who have attempted to deal with the subject of primitive peoples, he was unable to conceive of a condition of society in which women's natural instincts played a conspicuous part in regulating the social customs and in formulating the laws by which they were governed. The extreme modesty and sensitiveness which are observed as a characteristic of both sexes in the marriage relation, and the reserve of the youths at festivals in which young women are reported to have appeared naked, may not be ascribed to the laws of Lycurgus, but, on the other hand, appear as direct results of those checks upon the animal instincts in the male which the former strength and independence of women had imposed. At a later age, for instance that of Plutarch, the spectacle of young maidens appearing on occasions of public festivity in a single garment, loose and reaching a little below the knee, would have been associated with ideas of disgrace and shame, but under a condition of society in which the animal instincts had not wholly gained the ascendancy over the higher faculties, or in which the characters peculiar to women had not been overshadowed or subdued by the grosser elements developed in human nature, such a proceeding might not, as we have seen, be inconsistent with the purest motives and the highest aims. Something of the extent to which the influence of women was exerted to stimulate bravery and courage in the opposite sex is shown in the description by Plutarch of the festivals in which the young people appeared before each other in a semi-nude state to practice the popular games of strength and skill. Concerning these festivals, this writer remarks that the young women engaged in little raillery upon those who lacked skill or who had not done their best, while on such as deserved them they sang encomiums, thus exciting in the young men a useful emulation and love of glory. Plutarch observes also that those who were praised for their bravery and celebrated among the virgins went away perfectly happy, while their satirical glances were no less cutting than serious admonitions. These facts indicate something of the extent to which female influence still survived in ancient Sparta, and reveal plainly the fact that although in the time of Lycurgus the coarser instincts developed in human nature had made considerable headway, they had not totally eclipsed the finer characters peculiar to women, as was the case of a later period of Grecian history, more particularly among the Athenians. As for the virgins appearing naked, Plutarch himself assures us there was nothing disgraceful in it, because everything was conducted with modesty and without one indecent word or action. Nay, it caused a simplicity of manner and an emulation for the best habit of body. Their ideas, too, were naturally enlarged, while they were not excluded from their share of bravery and honor. Regarding the commingling of the sexes among the Spartans, Mr. Grote says: "When we read the restrictions which Spartan custom imposed upon the intercourse, even between married persons, we shall conclude without hesitation that the public intermixture of the sexes led to no such liberties between persons not married as might be likely to arise from it under other circumstances. It was a Dorian who first threw aside his heavy girdle during the Olympian contests and ran naked to the goal. In an allusion to this incident, and also to the custom of Spartan virgins appearing in a semi-nude state in the presence of the opposite sex during the performance of their gymnastic feats, C. O. Müller says that a display of the naked form when all covering was unnecessary and inconvenient was quite in keeping with the character and temper of the Dorians. Concerning the style of dress adopted by the Doric virgins, it is said to have consisted of a loose woolen garment called a himation. It was without sleeves and was fastened over the shoulders with large clasps. The himation was completely joined only on one side, the other side being left loose and fastened with a buckle or clasp. Doubtless this adjustment of the gown was to enable the wearer to open it and throw it back, thereby securing greater freedom to the limbs while running and wrestling. This simple garment reached only to the calf of the leg, and was worn sometimes with a girdle, sometimes without. The pure state of morals in Sparta furnishes an explanation of that peculiar style of dress among women which has elicited so much comment among later writers, and which has stamped the Spartan women as creatures especially devoid of modesty. True modesty was evidently one of the leading characteristics of this people among both sexes, but the simulation of it, which, by the way, is usually practiced just in proportion as the lower propensities have gained the ascendancy over the higher faculties, was doubtless absent in Spartan society. An illustration of the state of public morals in ancient Sparta may be observed in the following dialogue. A stranger once asked a Spartan what penalty their law attached to adultery. The reply was, "My friend, there are no adulterers in our country." Upon being further interrogated, "But what if there should be one?" the Spartan replied, "Why, then he must forfeit a bull so large that he might drink of the Eurotas from the top of Mount Taygetus." When the stranger asked, "How can such a bull be found?" the man answered with a smile, "How can an adulterer be found in Sparta?" Commenting on the relative position of Doric and Athenian women, C. O. Müller says, "The domestic relation of the wife to her husband among the Dorians was in general the same as that of the ancient Western nation, described by Homer as universal among the Greeks, and which existed at Rome till a late period, the only difference being that the peculiarities of the custom were preserved by the Dorians more strictly than elsewhere. Amongst the Dorians of Sparta, the wife was honored by her husband with the title of mistress, a gallantry belonging to the north of Greece and also practiced by the Thessalians, which was used neither ironically nor unmeaningly. Nay, so strange did the importance which the Lacedaemonian women enjoy, and the influence which they exercised as the managers of their households and mothers of families, appear to the Greeks, at a time when the prevalence of Athenian manners prevented a due consideration for national customs, that Aristotle supposed Lycurgus to have attempted, but without success, to regulate the lives of women as he had regulated that of the men, and the Spartans were frequently censured for submitting to the yoke of their wives. It has been truly said that nowhere else in Greece do we find traces of that power exercised by women over their sons when arrived at manhood, observed among Spartan mothers. When a woman of another country said to Gorgo, the wife of Leonidas, "You of Lacedaemon are the only women in the world that rule the men," she replied, "We are the only women that bring forth men." With our present knowledge respecting the influence and independence of the Spartan women, it is folly for certain writers to assert that married women were confined within the house and that only virgins appeared in public. There is some evidence going to prove that at Crete, at Sparta, and at Olympia, women were not only spectators at the Olympian games, but that they engaged personally in the chariot contests. According to an inscription in Della Sella, it is shown that women presided over the public gymnastic exercises in that town. One very important fact going to show whence proceeded the reforms of Lycurgus is that the mandates of the oracle were supreme. The oracles controlled the rulers, but women always controlled or interpreted the oracles. The celebrated Rhetra of Lycurgus, in which unlimited authority is given to the people to reject or adopt the proposal of the king, was given according to the direction of the Pythian Apollo, whose mandates were interpreted by women. In an earlier age, the chiefs of the gentes were elected by all the people, and they held their office by virtue of their relationship to the leader of the gens, who was a woman. That the honor due to women was still recognized in Sparta is shown in the following from Plutarch in relation to the election of senators. The person who had received the loudest acclamations was declared duly elected, whereupon he was crowned with a garland, and a number of young men followed him about to extol his virtues. The women sang his praises and blessed his life and conduct. 2 portions were set before him, one of which he carried to the gates of the public hall, where the women were in waiting to receive him. To the one for whom he had the greatest esteem he presented the portion, saying, "That which I received as a mark of honor I give to you." The woman thus honored was conducted home with great applause by the rest of the women. Spartan men were forbidden to marry foreign women. Hence, contrary to the customs of surrounding nations, at this early period wives as well as husbands were native born. All were Spartans, which fact probably accounts in a measure for the exalted position occupied by women. Both in Sparta and in Crete the form of marriage was by capture. Thus, although in the time of Lycurgus the Spartan men and women both belonged to the same stock, it is plain that originally they were of different tribes. Of capture as practiced in Sparta, Müller says that it was clearly an ancient national custom, founded on the idea that the young woman could not surrender her freedom and virgin purity unless compelled by the violence of the stronger sex. According to Plutarch, after the arrangements of the wedding had been completed, the bridegroom rushed in, seized the bride from among her assembled friends, and bore her away. The Dorian stock alone seems to have preserved the ancient custom, and among these peoples, wherever they are found, woman's influence is in the ascendancy. According to Herodotus and Aristotle, the Spartans, the Cratons, and the Lycians were related. The people of Crete still preserved their ancient usages, hence may be observed the reason why Lycurgus visited that country in quest of information before enunciating the laws which were to restore order among the Spartans. In Lycia, as in Crete, woman's influence must still have been considerable. Of the Lycians, Herodotus says, "Their customs are partly Cretan, partly Carian. They take the mother's and not the father's name. Ask a Lycian who he is, and he answers by giving his own name, that of his mother, and so on in the female line. Moreover, if a free woman marry a man who is a slave, their children are full citizens. But if a free man marry a foreign woman, or live with a concubine, even though he be the first person in the state, the children forfeit all the rights of citizenship." On the manner of reckoning descent through women, which prevailed in Lycia, Curtius remarks that the usage extends far beyond the territory commanded by the Lycian nationality. It is still extant in India. It was practiced in ancient Egypt, among the Etruscans, and among the Cretans, who were closely related to the Lycians. This writer observes that if Herodotus regards the usage in question as thoroughly peculiar to the Lycians, it must have maintained itself longest among them of all the nations related to the Greeks, as is also proved by the Lycian inscriptions. As the Sabines, who united with the Romans in founding Rome, claimed relationship with the Dorians, we may reasonably expect to find among them somewhat of that womanly influence which characterized the Spartans, and some hint among their customs of an earlier age of female independence. Although the Sabine women did not voluntarily assume the position of wives to the Romans, but were captured by them. When the two nations united, the Sabines were regarded rather in the light of conferring honor upon Rome than as detracting from its dignity. Of the early Romans, Ortolan says, "The connubium, or right of marriage, did not exist between males and females of different cities, unless by special agreement between those cities. Thus it was that the primitive Romans, according to tradition, were compelled to resort to ambuscade and force in order to carry off their first wives." The Roman family, like the Roman state, began with slavery. Of the Romans it has been said that they acquired their territory, their property, and even their wives by the lance. With them the lance became the symbol of property, and even had a place in their judicial procedure. Their slaves were booty, their wives were booty, and their children begotten of them the fruit of their possessions. The right of fathers under Romulus to sell their sons, upon the accession of Numa the Sabine ruler to the office of lawgiver, was withdrawn, and the reason given for it was consideration for women. According to Plutarch, Numa reckoned it a great hardship that a woman should marry a man as free and then live with him as a slave. In the life of Numa, by Plutarch, we have a hint of a former age of universal freedom. It was one of these rulers' institutions that once a year the slaves should be entertained along with their masters at a public feast, there to enjoy the fruits which they had helped to produce. The same writer assures us that some are of the opinion that this is a remnant of that equality which was in existence in the times of Saturn, when there was neither master nor slave, but all were upon the same footing. Plutarch quotes from Macrobius, who says that this feast was celebrated in Italy long before the building of Rome. From all the facts to be gathered relative to the relations of the sexes in the age of Numa, it is plain that that freedom of action exercised by women in a former age among the Dorians was rapidly declining, and that the early independence which has characterized the Sabine women was beginning to bring upon them the condemnation of the Roman lords. This is shown in the fact that it soon became Numa's arduous task to institute certain restrictions on their former liberties. In a comparison between Lycurgus and Numa, Plutarch, in referring to this subject, observes: Numa's strictures as to virgins tended to form them to that modesty which is the ornament of their sex, but the great liberty which Lycurgus gave them brought upon them the censure of the poets, particularly Ibycus. The grossness which had been developed during the 400 or 500 years following the age of Lycurgus, and the jealousy with which the movements of women had come to be regarded, are illustrated by the following stanza from Euripides: These quit their homes, ambitious to display amidst the youths their vigour in the race, or feats of wrestling, whilst their airy robe flies back and leaves their limbs uncovered. It is evident that not only in private life, but in their desire for public activity also, the independence of the Sabine women failed to comport with the ideas already in vogue among their Roman husbands regarding the proper sphere of women. Consequently, their behavior was thought to be too bold and too masculine, in particular to their husbands, for they considered themselves as absolute mistresses in their houses. Nay, they wanted a share in affairs of state, and delivered their sentiments with great freedom concerning the most weighty matters. A woman even appeared in the forum to plead her own cause, whereupon the grave senators ordered that the oracles be consulted that the true import of the singular phenomenon might be revealed. Plutarch, who lived in the 1st century of the Christian era, after having recounted these misdemeanors, assures us that what is recorded of a few infamous women is a proof of the obedience and meekness of Roman matrons in general. Doubtless, in Plutarch's time, Roman women had lost much of that influence which characterized the female sex in an earlier age. It is not therefore remarkable that by this writer the Sabine women should have been regarded as too forward and as altogether infamous. That their conduct was not all that could be desired by the outlaws and bandits who founded Rome, and who had stolen them for wives, is evident, and the regulations of the rulers respecting them show plainly that much judicious training and a vast amount of repression were required before they were fitted for the peculiar duties devolving upon them as sexual slaves. We are told by Plutarch that the regulations established by Lycurgus, instead of encouraging the licentiousness of the women which prevailed at a later period, operated to render adultery unknown amongst them. Yet this writer forgets to mention the fact that in Sparta, in the time of this ruler, there was no demand for prostitution by a class who held all the wealth and power, and who were therefore in a position to regulate this matter to suit their own tastes and inclinations. On the contrary, the female sex was free, not only in the matter of sexual relations, but in the exercise of all their natural tendencies and in the direction of all their movements. The idea of sex, which among later and more thoroughly sensualized nations became first and foremost among the Dorians, so far as equal rights, obligations, and duties were concerned, was ignored or left to nature to regulate. Plutarch, like most writers who have dealt with the relations of the sexes, fails to observe the fact that just to the extent in the past history of mankind to which women have been free and independent, licentiousness has disappeared, and that just in proportion as the influence of women has declined, in just such proportion have shame, profligacy, disease, and infamy prevailed. To produce a state of society in which the animal instincts ruled supreme, and in which passion was the recognized god, women had first to become physically dependent and mentally enslaved. For so long a time have women been judged by masculine standards, it is not perhaps remarkable that male writers of these later times can discern in the simplicity and chastity existing among the Dorians in the age of Lycurgus no evidence of a former era of female independence. Neither is it singular, as for so many ages women have been subject to the pleasure and control of the opposite sex, that we should be repeatedly told by writers who have dealt with the usages of the Spartans that their women were permitted to do this and allowed to do that, although the facts in the case prove that in all their movements they were guided by their own wills, exercised either directly or through the oracles of the gods. When the customs of the ancient Dorians are viewed without prejudice, the fact will doubtless be observed that they originated not in a depraved and licentious state of society, but on the contrary, that they were the direct result of that freedom of action which characterizes purity of life and a high standard of thought and action. End of section 14.